Now, if you've been a part of this church for any time at all, you know that I don't often change a message based upon the circumstances around us. There have been a few major things that have happened in our time here. I recall the night that Tawan committed suicide many years ago, and that next morning I was scheduled to preach from Ecclesiastes 3. There's a time to live, a time to die. You might remember a major windstorm that came through about 3.5 years ago, and I was scheduled to preach on Jesus calming the storm. God has a way of doing those things. I certainly believe that the message of hope that comes from the Apostles' Creed, as we would have talked about the Ascension today, certainly would fit. And as I researched the Ascension more this week, I gained a much better appreciation for it than I'd ever had before. But as rapidly as things changed this week, I decided, there's a lot of fear. We need to talk about fear, and specifically this latest coronavirus, COVID-19. You may have heard of it. I don't know, unless you're in a hole somewhere. I see nurses even nodding. Why? Marcia, you're retired. Why? Yeah, okay. But COVID-19 is not the first coronavirus. In fact, it is the 7th coronavirus. There are 4 very common coronaviruses that cause our normal colds. But the last 3 have been rather significant in nature. In 2002, we had the SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome that infected nearly 8,100 people in 24 countries and killing about 800 of them. No cases of SARS have been reported since 2004, however. In 2012, we had the MERS virus, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, and it has since then infected approximately 2,500 individuals, with approximately 1/3 of those dying from 27 different countries. Other viruses, such as the bird flu and the swine flu, have impacted our world over the last couple of decades. Just over 100 years ago, we had the Spanish flu, one of the greatest pandemics of all time, which killed somewhere, estimates are hard to know for sure, but somewhere between 20 to 50 million people. This coming 1 year after World War I ended, in which approximately 20 million others died. But this new virus, COVID-19, has the attention of the world. It started in China, as did SARS. It is now spread to more than 100 countries. And realistically, about 2 weeks ago, all of us thought, well, that's a problem for over there, and maybe it'll impact us, but little did we know how much it would impact us. It went from an epidemic, the word epi means upon, so it went from an epidemic of upon the people to a pandemic this week. Pandemic means all the people. Some have estimated that as many as 45% of all Americans may get the virus. That is 150 million Americans at 45%. This pandemic is causing fear and disruption in ways that our world has never seen. Certainly, we have had other issues. I mentioned the Spanish flu. I mentioned the World War I, World War II. There have been other wars that have caused all kinds of disruption. We have had earthquakes. We have had tsunamis. We have had tornadoes. We have had all kinds of disrupting type of events. We have had plagues. We have had famines. We have had so many different types. But never before in the history of our world have things changed so rapidly. This time last week, it's a concern. By early this week, sports leagues were thinking about, well, what do we do? And now we have billion-dollar tournaments being canceled. Professional leagues being suspended and or canceled. And the impact that comes not just from now I'm worried about being sick, but how do I pay my bills, because this is how I make a living, by working in an arena or working in a restaurant, and restaurants preparing to close, very likely, as they have in other countries such as France and Italy. Decisions are being made by the hour as to how people and organizations are going to respond, and those decisions will continue to be made in the days and weeks, if not months ahead. We must realize that this could be over within a couple of months, but it could last throughout the rest of the year. We simply don't know. There is nothing known, not enough known about this virus. So what is our response, not as part of the people in general, but as the church? As God's people, how should we respond? And our response should be twofold. First off, and the music has captured this very well, we need to have a trust in God, and we need to have a love for others. So Leon read for us just a few moments ago from Psalm 56. And as a follower of Christ, we need to first realize that this psalm is very much about trusting in God. But it is also very much about acknowledging the reality of fear. Fear is real, but it need not rule. Fear is probably the strongest emotion because once it grips us, it does not let go. If we are angry, eventually time will kind of take away some of that anger and whatnot, but fear does not let go. And of course, fear is something that the Bible doesn't condone. Famously, the Bible says 365 times, do not be afraid or do not fear or something along those lines. This is leap year, so we got the extra day to fear and we're using it to our advantage, I suppose. But fear may not be right, but it is natural. But we also must keep fear in perspective. Some will actually call fear a sin, and I do understand the rationale for this. And I want to explain that rationale first, but then let me show you why from Scripture, from this psalm specifically, why I do not believe that fear is a sin. First, fear ultimately is a lack of trust in someone or something. And the Bible does say, do not fear, do not be afraid, in language that is very similar to do not lie, do not steal, do not commit adultery, etc. But lying and stealing and adultery are choices that we make to do something. Fear is a natural response to something. Now, fear in that sense is very much like anger. Anger is a response to something that is going on around us. But as Paul writes in Ephesians, in your anger, do not sin. I think that this is not in the Bible, but I think we could kind of treat fear in the same way. In your fear, do not sin. The sin might be different than the sin that might come from anger, but the principle would be the same. In Psalm 56, we see that David had fear, but he knew where to turn in the midst of that fear. In Psalm 56:3, David says, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you. This verse was actually the very first verse that I taught our children when they were young. As each night we would get together on the couch and we would have a time of devotion, we would pray and sing a song or two, and this started at a very, very, very early age. And then we would take them to bed, and of course children at night would have some fears, and so Susan and I were putting them in bed and maybe one with one child and one with the other and switching off, however that might have happened. I would teach them this verse, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you. Helping them to understand that in the midst of their fear, mommy and daddy would not always be there. We could not always be there, but God could be there. And so that's where their trust needed to be. But what is great about this chapter, and again, I'm not going to read it because Leon just read it for us a few moments ago, but what is great about this chapter is that David never confesses a sin or repents of his fear. That's important to us. And we know that David was a man who, if he was confronted with sin, would confess. Psalm 51 is a psalm that is a psalm, I should say, that was done out of confession, out of repentance. Against you only have I sinned, God. But in Psalm 56, he acknowledges his fear very openly, very honestly, very candidly. He details it, and yet never does he say, Lord, I am sorry. Forgive me for being afraid. At least not directly, as he did in Psalm 51. In fact, if you look at Psalm 56, David begins with the why he is afraid, then he makes a declaration of trust, and then note this is so important, then after making his declaration of trust, he shares more details about why he is afraid. He may have stated his intention to trust in God, but that has not freed his mind from the perils all around him. Now, the perils of that day were not the plague, unless you consider the Philistines a plague to Israel, which in a way they were. David was taken captive in Gath, which was the hometown of Goliath, after Goliath had been killed. He had been taken captive there. He was fearful for his life and what they might do to him. But he realizes that simply stating that he trusts God does not remove him from that danger. But, and again, this is key, he does not let that danger or fear cripple him. Notice the structure of this psalm. In verses 1 and 2, David asks God to watch over him because of his enemies. That is, David acknowledges his fear and plainly states it to God. Be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me, is how the psalm begins. Then in verses 3 and 4, we have this declaration, this intention of trust, where he says, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What a great declaration. What can flesh do to me? And so now, if we are the holier than thou Christian, we say, okay, we have acknowledged our fear to God, but now we have declared our trust. And so now my life is good. My life is fine. I have no more fear. I can just move on and never have any problems again. But David was not a holier than thou Christian, apparently, because the next 3 verses are all about his fear. And there's something that we can learn from that. Verses 5 through 7, having acknowledged God and having acknowledged his fear to trust God, David details why he is afraid. Let me read these verses for us. Again, remember, he has already declared his intention to trust. He says, all day long they injure my cause, all their thoughts against me for evil. They stir up strife, they lurk, they watch my steps as they have waited for my life. For their crime will they escape? In wrath cast down the peoples, O God. He is acknowledged. He has fully acknowledged God. He knows the right thing to do, but he still lays out the fear that grips him. Then in verses 8 through 13, David acknowledges why he can trust God. David acknowledges that he will trust God once again. So a psalm with only 13 verses has 5 verses that talk about the reality of fear and 8 verses that talk about the reality of God triumphing over fear. 38% of the verses in this psalm talk about fear. Now that's important again because it doesn't say 1 verse or 2 verses, here's the beginning of the psalm, here's the fear, and now David has confessed his desire, his intention to trust in God, and so we have 1% fear and 99% God, and that's what the holier than thou Christian is going to say, even on days like today when this fear, when this pandemic is all around us. Well, nobody needs to be afraid, it's not that big a deal. We might have thought that 2 weeks ago, but ladies and gentlemen, it is a big deal. And it's going to be a bigger deal in the days and weeks and months ahead. But David confessed his intention to trust God. He never confessed his sin of fear. Fear is a natural response to the developments around us. And so, as you may have fear, as others may have fear, we need not beat them down. We'll come more to that in just a moment. For now, let us realize that David, a mighty warrior who slayed thousands upon thousands of people, who as a teenage boy faced the largest giant in the land and took him down with a stone, had fear. But David had more trust in God than he had in fear. If 38% of this psalm relates to the fears that David had, that means over 60%, just shy of 62%, address the goodness of God. And again, I'm sure that there are Christians who read this, these holier-than-thou Christians, that will read this and say, well, obviously David did not have enough faith if he just continued talking about fear. I would like to put them in front of David. It is important that we think of ourselves as holy. If we are Christians, we have the holiness of God put on us, the righteousness of Christ put on us because of his death. But that does not alleviate some realities of this life, like the fear around us. But maybe we should be 99% God and 1% fear. That may be what we should be, but the reality is that we are not there yet. I am glad for those Christians who have it all figured out, but you know what? I don't have that level of faith that they have. And while I'm not overly concerned about the coronavirus personally, about getting it personally, I do understand that I am the pastor of a congregation who has many people who are at much higher risk, and I have to consider that. Could I be a carrier of that even if I do not have the symptoms of that? I have to face and understand those realities as we go forward. So I say right now, we're having church today. I plan to have church every week. But I also understand, not because the government might say don't have church, but it might be prudent at some point for us to say, you know what? I will stand here and I will look into a camera and say hi and watch the sermon, and you all can watch it from home. I don't know where this is going to go. I don't know. As a leader, it is my responsibility to be as well prepared and to adapt to the situation as I possibly can, but we must realize no one in the history of the world has faced this type of issue that grows at this speed and the information that changes so fast. It's never happened before. And so we all must admit at some level that we are flying by the seat of our pants. And we will do what we can as we can. We must make wise decisions. I'm not going to cower to fear, but again, we should all be prudent, and at some point that might mean that it is best that we don't meet publicly. I can't say that for now. That is not my intention, but I can't say for certain. I don't want the virus. I know you don't either, but we're going to take precautions, all of us. But again, fear should not be our biggest concern. And yet, whatever fear that you may have, the example that David gives us in Psalm 56 is one that we can have very legitimate fears, and we'll talk about different fears in a moment. But in the midst of fully trusting God, we can honestly and openly share those fears with God, and as I'm going to suggest in a moment, also with one another. When we do that, we can not only show our trust in God, but we can also help others to better process their fears and to move forward as well. So at first, we must place our trust in God. The second thing that we need to do, the second response that people of God need to do, is to love our neighbor. We need to have love of our neighbor. It is during a time of a crisis, and this indeed is a crisis, that we should love our neighbor. Several months ago, when I was preaching on the parable of the Good Samaritan, I made the following statement that is as true now as it ever has been. We cannot love the people we label, and we will not label the people we love. I say that today because I saw a statistic when I was preparing my sermon that absolutely sickened me. This is one of the stupidest studies, stupidest questions I have ever seen asked. It is one of the stupidest statements that I have ever seen made in all my life, and I'm not as old as some of you, but I've seen a fair share. And the statement said this: there are far more Democrats that are concerned about contracting the coronavirus than there are Republicans. That's important. Why? Because people of all nations, of all races, of all religions are contracting this because of a political stance. Politicians are politicizing this particular issue. That isn't love, that is manipulation. And I will stand on record right now and say I will not vote for one politician who makes any stance or any statement like that for the rest of this year. And if that means I don't vote, or if I vote for me, I'm not going to vote for any politician that politicizes an issue like this, and most of them have at this point. That is absolutely irresponsible to even ask such a question. Because people are afraid, whether they are Democrat, Republican, Independent, Black, White, Latino, it doesn't matter. This is not isolating a certain group of people. This is isolating people. Certainly some are more fearful than others, but we do not need to beat down on people for their fears. We need to love them through those fears. Let me give you an example. Suppose that a child wakes up from a dream and is frightened. It happens. The child bravely gets out of bed to find a parent or parents to bring some security. Now, first off, realize how much courage goes into that child stepping out of their bed in that moment. If there's something underneath the bed. That takes a lot of courage to walk through the dark into another room. But in that moment, a parent's response could go many different ways, but let me just go to the edges a little bit here. One parent might respond, "You idiot. I told you there's nothing to be afraid of. We've gone through this every night. Everything's fine. I don't understand why you don't understand this. Just leave me alone so I can get some sleep, get out of here and go to bed." Another parent on the other extreme might say, "I'm so sorry you're afraid. Let's see what we can do to make this a little bit better. What if we check and make sure that everything is okay, and then I will lay down with you until you go back to sleep." Does that sound good? Other possibilities exist. But the first scenario is obviously rather harsh. The second would be considered compassionate. And yet in the church, I think when we see people sinning in various ways, or not responding with a level of faith that we might have, or having, in this case of the coronavirus, having a little bit more fear than I might or than you might, we act a little bit more like that first parent than we do the second. The first example is about selfish behavior. It's about selfishness. It's about a lack of care. The second example takes time, takes energy, takes love. And that's what we're supposed to do. Romans 12:15 says that we are to rejoice with those who rejoice, and we are to weep with those who weep. Now, most of us like rejoicing, and for many of us, it is more difficult to weep. And frankly, in those examples above, I would like to think that I would respond with the second example, but I know I am guilty of the first far too often. Because I'm selfish. Because I sin. However, Jesus tells me to love my neighbor as I do myself. He tells us to love our neighbor as we do ourselves. Thus, I must properly love myself in order to properly love others. We must properly love each other in order to love others. And when we do, the real benefit of the entire situation is that others can know that they are loved too, not just by us, but by God. That's our opportunity right now in the midst of the fear that's all around us. And there is fear. But there's an opportunity to show that God is in control. I don't know God's purpose in this. I'm not going to go around and say, God is using this as a tool to weed out this person, or whatever, as many people are saying. We do have an opportunity to rejoice when it is important, when it is appropriate, but we also have an opportunity to weep as well. We have an opportunity, as Paul writes in Galatians 6:2, to carry one another's burdens. We have an opportunity to stand together to oppose our enemy and whatever other obstacles might come before us. We can do this simply because Jesus loved his neighbor as much as he loved himself and showed us an example of how we could do that as well. Fear is real, but God is bigger than our fears. And if we truly love others, we will help them to know that truth as well, that God is bigger than their fears. This week, like last week, fear is going to be front and center. It's only going to get worse in the lives of millions, if not billions. But here's something that is so fascinating about this fear. Most of us fear something that is big, but the surface level of this virus is 1 divided by 25,400,000 of an inch. It is tiny. And yet it has created the kind of fear that not even terrorists who blew up planes and flew into buildings could provoke around the world. How can something so tiny cause so much fear? It's a good question, but it has, and it will. But COVID-19 is not the only fear in our world today, and it's not the only fear being experienced in our church right now. There are other health issues that are front and center. There are issues like cancer and other chronic diseases. Maybe your fears stem from a relationship with a friend, a coworker, a member of your family. Maybe it's learning to live after the loss of a loved one. Maybe your fear is financial. Maybe it's fears in the changes in our country, or in our state, in our town, in our church. I know the fears that some of you are experiencing. I know the fears that I face. I know most of the depths of the fears that are in my life, but I really don't know the depths of the fears in most of yours. But I do know that I have a God who desires me to trust him. Amen. He is a God who desires you individually to trust him. He is a God who desires us collectively to trust him. He is a God who does not change. So even though in the midst of moving away from the Apostles' Creed this week at least, which is itself a change, we are still focusing on our constant, on the constant in a world of change. And that constant is God. In a world of fear, God is our constant. So our journey letter today is the word journey. We are all on a journey of faith, and this journey will require us to acknowledge and confront our fears at times. So what I want to do is I want to present a couple of verses, and these are in your bulletin. I want to present a couple of verses, read them for you, and just give you a moment to reflect on each of these verses over the next few moments. Then in just a few more moments, we are going to take time to pray. The SBC has put out a statement about 4 different requests that they are asking all churches to pray today. The president has declared this a National Day of Prayer. Other organizations have asked churches to pray. And there are many things that we can pray regarding at this point, but there are 4 that we will focus on momentarily. But first, these 2 verses. And I chose these 2 verses because one talks about fear to an individual, and the other talks about fear as written to a church. The first is found in 2 Timothy 1:7. 2 Timothy 1:7. Paul writing to Timothy, talking about fanning the flame that had been put within him by God in the previous verses, a flame that had been put there by his mother and his grandmother in verses just before that. In 2 Timothy 1:7, Paul wrote, "For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control." That self-control there is what David had in the midst of his fear as he turned to God. That love is what I talked about that Jesus had. And that power comes to us from the Spirit of God. And that is the Spirit that he gave us to deal with. So that is individual. We'll give you a moment to reflect on that momentarily. But Philippians 4 verses 6 and 7 was written to a church. And thus it is meant for us to consider corporately. I know many of you will have this memorized, and you will think about it being about a personal understanding, and certainly we must incorporate it personally before we can incorporate it from a corporate perspective. But the verses say this: do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Let us realize that peace of God is what we need right now. That chapter goes on, the next set of verses talk about what we are to think about. I'm going to challenge you this week. And as you reflect on these two verses, this is why I share this with you now. If you're on Facebook, if you're watching the news, if you're listening to the radio, if you're watching TV, talking with friends, COVID-19 is going to come up. And the more we listen, the more we watch, the more concern we have. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have concern. I'm not saying we shouldn't even have some fear. I'm just saying, what is the source of correcting that fear? It's not going to be talking with most people. It's not going to be listening to the media. It's not going to be watching Facebook. It's going to be right here. Amen. So I challenge you, for every hour that you find yourself doing something else outside of the Bible that causes you a little bit of concern, spend 15 minutes. I'm not going to say hour for hour. I mean, that'd be great. Do 2 hours in the Bible for every hour you watch the news. That'd be wonderful. You'll forget about COVID-19 and every other problem you have, maybe, at least for a short time. But I'm not saying that. Just spend about a quarter of all the time you invest in other areas in the Bible, and I promise you that even though you might have fears, you will feel a little bit better. Read Psalm 56. Reflect on 2 Timothy 1:7, Philippians 4, 6 and 7, or 8 and 9 and 10 as well, whatever it might be. So for just a couple of moments, we're going to sit quietly. No music, no nothing. I just want you to reflect first on 2 Timothy 1:7, 3 or 4 minutes. And then, I'll not that time is important here, but I'll give you a cue maybe after about 3 or 4 minutes. And then 3 or 4 minutes on Philippians 4, 6, and 7. Again, they're printed for you in your bulletin. And then I'll give our next steps. And we'll close with a time of prayer. If you haven't already, go ahead and move your mindset over to the passage from Philippians 4. Our next steps for today are learned. We all need to learn to better trust God through our times of fear. And to love, loving others to do the same. As followers of Christ, we can see this as an opportunity. In fact, we must see this disruption in our lives as an opportunity. Not that we don't have our concerns, not that we're not fearful as well, but fear can drive people in many different directions. But one of those directions can be to have people seek purpose and meaning in their lives that they might otherwise not see. We saw this on September the 16th, 2001. We saw it on September the 23rd, 2001. 2 Sundays immediately following the terrorist attacks where churches were full. But by September 30th, everything is back to normal. By 2002, churches were back to normal. What I'm saying is that as people look to find meaning in their lives, they will be more open to God. And the reason that my intention is to keep this place open is that a church is a hospital of sorts. Amen. And we would not close down a hospital for a health crisis. So why would we close down a church for a faith or a fear crisis? Again, that's my intention now. If the governor says that churches should close, we'll take that into consideration, but I don't bow to the governor. We must be prudent. We must be realistic. But people need a place to turn. Amen. And if that is this church, then the risks that we must take may be the risks that we must take. Again, those conversations will be had when and if they need to be had, but for now, we're having this church tonight. Mm-hmm. We're gathering on Wednesday night. We'll meet next Sunday morning. And if for whatever reason things would change, we'll send out text or Facebook messages, whatever, put it on the website, etc. But what I want to do for now is that I want to take this time for some corporate prayer. And I joked with Roger and Ann earlier as walking in here. I mean, there's a whole section back in that area with like, what, 3 or 4 rows where nobody's seated. 4 of the last 5 rows, there's one person back there, and we thought maybe people might be all spread out today, but you're not. And so I thought, well, maybe if we do this prayer thing right now, people are going to stand up against the wall and shout across I didn't know, but I think we might be comfortable getting close enough together to pray. But what I want to do is I just want to gather in some groups. You all have these, but I want 4 groups to form, if you would, and I'd like for each of you to pray over one of these ideas. Let me read them. Again, they're in your bulletin, but ask God in His mercy to stop this pandemic and save lives. We know that God is in the business of saving lives. Not only in our communities, but around the world, particularly in places that are unequipped medically to deal with the virus. And Isaiah 59, 1 and 2 is the verse that is mentioned here. Pray for President Donald Trump and other government leaders, international, federal, state, and local, to have the wisdom to direct us in the best courses of action for prevention and care. Romans 13, 1 through 4 gives us some guidance in that. The third group, Scripture says, teach us to number our days carefully so that we may develop wisdom in our hearts. Pray that the Lord will give us wisdom in this moment of fear as the foundations of what we know are shaken, that others would realize how fragile life is and how real eternity is, and they would see their need to turn to God. Psalm 90, verse 12. And the fourth one, ask God to protect our missionaries and their families around the globe, using this global crisis to advance His good news to the whole world. Mark 16:15. And not just missionaries and their families around the globe, but the missionaries of this church who are in here right now. You're all missionaries. You all have that opportunity. So in just a moment we'll break up and pray over each of those into 4 different groups. I want to close my time here by reading 5 short verses from James chapter 4, which are certainly pertinent in any time, but are especially pertinent in a day like today. James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17 talk about how quickly life changes. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow, we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. Ladies and gentlemen, fear is among us. It is upon us. It is real, but it need not rule. We know what we need to do. We need to turn to God, trust God, and we need to love our neighbors. For him or her who knows what to do and does not do it, it is sin. Let's break into groups and pray. Let's do this corner as 1, 2, 3, 4. So are we in